Good afternoon, everyone. As was already said, I'm Zoe Birnie, Technical Specialist in the Impact team at Greening Australia, and today I'll be sharing how we plan and evaluate ecological restoration projects to demonstrate outcomes for species conservation and deepen our impact. And you'll notice that it's got a quite strict ecological restoration perspective. Great. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land that we're meeting on today. I pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging, and extend that to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples across the country, and particularly in the regions that we work. So today I'm going to run through Greening Australia's approach to impact, which is guided by our impact framework, and then I'm going to discuss how it's applied through 3 different case studies. And then I'll wrap up with some key recommendations. So, what do we actually mean by impact? At Greening Australia, impact means to us a sustained effect on change to or benefit to environment, community and economies as a consequence of our actions, projects, research or policies. So this diagram shows the basic logic that sits behind our impact framework. On the left-hand side, we start with our inputs. These are the financial, human and material resources that go into projects. And then we move to our activities and our outputs. So this describes what was done and how we did it. And then as we move further along to the right, then we start to see what our impacts, our outcomes and impacts are. And this tells us more about why this matters in terms of environment, community and economic outcomes. What we're trying to communicate with this diagram is that we need to move beyond thinking just about the inputs, activities and outputs, which is typically all we have time to really measure in traditionally funded restoration projects that might only have a life cycle of around 3 years. At that point, we can really only look at early establishment of plantings and survival rates. But we need to increasingly look at how we can frame our actions in terms of the outcomes and impact. So what this looks like, as well as talking about the number of stems that we've planted and the people that were involved in our projects, we need to show why we're putting the stems in the ground in a particular location. That might be for the benefit of a particular threatened species, it might be to improve species diversity, might be to improve land productivity, increase climate resilience, and it might also be to have impacts for community wellbeing. So we just need to increasingly shift towards this thinking. That does come with a whole lot of increased complexity and longer timeframes to actually do that in practice though. So at Greening Australia, our work is guided by 3 core pillars, being environment, community and economy. Within each of these pillars, we've defined several impact themes, and these help to guide the impact that we aim to achieve or the desired end states that we're working towards. With the time I've got today, I'll be focusing just on some of our environmental measures, but as was already said and spoken about really clearly earlier today, the community is at the heart of everything we do as well, and partnering is really, really important. Within each of these impact themes, we also have a defined number of performance measures, and these are the things that actually help us to identify how far we've moved towards our desired future states, which are framed by those impact themes. So moving into some applied case studies, I'm going to run through 3 projects that have a threatened species focus. So I'm going to take you first to southwest Victoria to talk about the southeastern red-tailed black cockatoo. Then we'll move to East Gippsland to talk about growling grass frogs and green and golden bell frogs. And then we're going to move up to the ACT to talk about woodland birds. So looking at building habitat for this special cockatoo. The southeastern red-tailed black cockatoo is a really fussy, picky eater, preferring the seeds of desert and brown stringy barks and at some times of the year bull oak. This species also requires tree hollows for breeding, which is found in old age eucalypts. This species is facing a number of challenges, including habitat loss, fragmentation, and this is really causing a shortage of food resources for this species and nest site availability. So our actions to support the conservation of this species are framed by several of these impact themes, including increasing ecosystem area, increasing biodiversity, and hopefully contributing over the long term to a change in threatened taxa. And I'll touch on these at a high level today, but don't have time to go into the nitty-gritties. So aligned to our impact themes, we have defined activities to help rebuild feeding habitat, and these are aligned with Action 4 in this Species National Recovery Plan around revegetation. So to do this, we look at population distribution mapping, and we also look at ecological vegetation types that were there before pre-clearing, before the clearing occurred. And importantly, we look at focusing our efforts in areas where the desert stringybark and brown stringybark are missing from the ecosystem, or where they have low natural regeneration. Alongside replanting these core species, we also look at installing artificial nest boxes, because we know that it's going to take a really long time for hollows to naturally occur. So what does success look like, and what have we achieved? Our outputs to date include planting approximately 20,000 of these stringybarks a year since 2019. And like I said before, that's typically the endpoint of our projects and what we have time to measure and funding to measure. But we want to move beyond this to understand the impact and outcomes of these activities. So we've observed that it takes about 15 years for southeastern red-tailed black cockatoos to turn up in these revegetated areas and for food to be available for them. So this image was taken at the Bank Australia Conservation Reserve in 15-year-old stringybark revegetation, and there's a nice plentiful seed crop there for that species to enjoy. So there we can demonstrate that we can put back this feeding habitat, but what's the impact on the threatened species status of this species? So we're not quite there yet. As I said, we've been planting these stringybarks for around the last 6 years, so it's going to take quite a while before we can actually measure that, but that's where we're aiming to go, and we'll pull in some other data to help assess that. Moving now down to East Gippsland in Victoria, and I'm going to talk about these two special frogs. So the growling grass frog and green and golden bell frog were once sympatric across East Gippsland in Victoria, as well as higher altitude regions in southeast Australia. But these two species now face a decline in range distribution and abundance. So like the other example, these species are facing quite a number of threats, but there are things that we can do to help them. So again, our actions are defined by a set of our impact themes, and then our specific activities are guided by making sure that we're working in the right location and rebuilding the right kind of habitat. So to understand this, Greening Australia commissioned a study to identify priority locations for habitat creation and enhancement. This study used a patch occupancy model combined with an optimisation approach to identify options that maximise metapopulation viability for both species in the Avon-Perry River area. We then also utilised the habitat design standards to make sure that, again, we're creating the right kinds of wetland habitat for these species to thrive. And then we also looked at how we can buffer these wetland areas with the appropriate vegetation to support the broader system. So what does success look like for this case study? To date, we've installed 13 habitat breeding ponds on the lower Perry River system since 2022. And what does this mean for this species? Within the first year, occupancy was recorded within 4 of the ponds, and 1 breeding event was recorded. By year 2, 6 of the 13 ponds were occupied, with over 170 metamorphs and 56 newly emerged frogs recorded. So this demonstrates that we've created new homes for these frogs with these wetland ponds. What's really cool is that we have an early indication of impact for this species as well. So surveys undertaken in 2024 estimated a population of between 150 to 180 growling grass frogs on the property in 2016, for context, the entire population across the Gippsland Lakes was only between 40 to 60. So this is a really positive indication that we can get towards impact, but again, identifying that sustained change is going to take longer to observe and measure. Last one, I'll zip through this. So again, looking at woodland birds in the ACT, we've got a number of challenges that these woodland birds are facing. And so what we aim to do is to undertake revegetation in degraded sites in agricultural landscapes through a variety of methods. And we've also, through the work of some really dedicated colleagues, got over 20 years of monitoring data at these sites so that we can start to look at the measuring the effect of revegetation for woodland birds. And I'm just going to quickly zip through that. So this map just shows where these sites are spread across the Southern Tablelands region, and these are all throughout an agricultural landscape, and this comprises a mix of direct seeding sites, tube stock planting sites, as well as remnant and cleared paddock sites, which is the counterfactual here. So what are the outcomes? Here, I'll just try and summarise. So we've overall recorded the highest number of species in the revegetated sites, with 139 species observed across 103 sites. Remnant, we observed 98 species across 29 sites, and at our paddock sites we observed 48 species. So the key message here is that we're seeing a higher number and a higher diversity of bird species in the revegetated areas compared to the cleared paddocks. What's really cool is that it wasn't just our generalist bird species that are turning up in these revegetated areas, but also a number of our threatened or declining species. This just gives a visual of what one of these sites looks like. So this is a travelling stock reserve in New South Wales, Southern Tablelands. As you can see, it's pretty degraded, really open, lacking species diversity, and we're not seeing a huge diversity of woodland birds at this site. After revegetation, 8 years later, we can see that we're starting to get some early establishment of some mid-story and overstory coming back, and we've got a couple more species. But the real step change is occurring after 23 years, where we can see that we've got, again, more structure and composition put back into this site, and we're seeing a huge increase in the number of species that are now turning up at this site. And this just, again, shows the impact of revegetation compared to that cleared and degraded state. So the recommendations, we must plan for impact and evaluate outcomes for species conservation and restoration projects, and we need to move beyond the activities and outputs. We also need to work towards achieving multiple outcomes, so I've focused pretty heavily on environmental outcomes, but we need to also think about community and economic outcomes. It's really, really important. And this is less of a recommendation and more of a thought and something we don't have the answer to. But when we're thinking about observing outcomes and impact, this takes a really long time, particularly for long-lived plant species. And so we've been thinking about what that means in the context of nature markets and how we can deal with the complexity and fluctuations in biodiversity outcomes over those long time scales. I just want to acknowledge all my colleagues and the partners that contributed to the projects that I spoke about today, and I want to leave you with this image which was taken at one of our properties in the Snowy Monaro region. This is an example of what large-scale revegetation looks like at the activity stage, and it will be quite a while before we observe impact here.